Think about the moment when the entire world around you, your government, your neighbors, your school, demands your silence. They demand your compliance, and they enforce that demand with overwhelming power. They make you afraid to speak, afraid to whisper, afraid even to think differently. In that silence, how do you find your voice? Where do you find the courage to stand up, knowing that your single act of truth could cost you everything? Your freedom, your future, your life. This is the story of a small group of university students, a few young men and one young woman, who faced that absolute silence and chose to speak. They lived in Munich, Germany during the darkest days of the 1940s. Their crime? To write the truth, to print the truth, to spread the truth. Their legacy is a light that reminds us that moral clarity is always possible, even in complete darkness. The year is 1942. The world is at war, but the greatest conflict for many people is the one being fought in their own hearts and minds. Hans Scholl, his younger sister, Sophie Scholl, and their friend, Christoph Probst, were students at the University of Munich. Hans was studying medicine. Sophie was studying philosophy and biology. Christoph, also in medicine, was a husband and a father of 3. They were bright, talented, and full of life, exactly the kind of young people who were supposed to be the future of the nation. But they were also witnesses. They had seen the gradual, suffocating takeover of their society. They had seen freedoms vanish. They had seen neighbors disappear. They had seen the truth itself become a dangerous, subversive act. The official narrative, the propaganda, was everywhere. It poured from the radio, covered the walls in posters, and was drilled into them in every classroom. Questioning it was treason. Doubting it was a criminal offense. The stakes were absolute. To whisper a word of dissent meant facing the full, swift, and merciless power of the regime. The fear was a tangible thing, a cold hand that gripped the heart of every single person. But for Hans, Sophie, and Christoph, that fear began to transform into something else. Moral revulsion. Their awakening was gradual, fueled by small acts of moral integrity. Hans and Christoph, as medical students, were periodically drafted as medics to serve on the Eastern Front. What they saw there was not the glorious, sanitized warfare of the propaganda films. They saw unadulterated suffering. They saw the cruelty of occupation. They saw the monstrous cost of an ideology that stripped people of their basic humanity. When they returned to Munich for their studies, the cognitive dissonance was unbearable. How could they live a normal life? Studying, laughing, drinking beer, knowing what they now knew. They couldn't. The moment a man's mind sees true evil, he can never truly unsee it. In the small, dimly lit room of Hans and Sophie, a conversation began. It was not a political discussion. It was a crisis of conscience. We know the truth. We know this entire system is built on lies, cruelty, and the destruction of the innocent. But what can we possibly do? They realized that the most dangerous thing was not the enemy's power. It was the passivity of good people. The vast, silent majority who knew something was wrong but did nothing. And so, they decided on an act of extraordinary courage. They would write and distribute leaflets. They called themselves the White Rose. Their operation was simple, pure, and breathtakingly risky. They were not soldiers. They had no weapons, no army, no access to media. Their only weapon was a small, manual duplicating machine, a simple tool for reproducing text, and their own unshakable belief in the power of an idea. The first 4 leaflets of the White Rose were written primarily by Hans and another friend, Alexander Schmorell. They were philosophical, theological, and moral calls to action. They did not advocate for violence or revolution. They appealed to the reader's individual moral responsibility. The pamphlets were astonishingly frank. One line read, "We will not be silent. We are your bad conscience. The White Rose will not leave you in peace." Think about that moment. A few students using a clunky old machine, printing pages in secret late at night. They would risk everything simply to mail these leaflets to professors, doctors, and intellectuals, hoping to awaken the slumbering conscience of their nation. And then Sophie joined. This is the true rehook of the story. Sophie, initially hesitant, became the absolute moral center of the group. Her involvement raised the stakes exponentially, transforming it from a few students venting their conscience to a moral movement that involved a young woman defying one of the world's most brutal patriarchal systems. She brought an incredible focus and resolve. As the Gestapo began to hunt down the source of the seditious pamphlets, the White Rose prepared for their final, most visible act of defiance. The final act occurred on February 18, 1943. The night before, Hans, Sophie, and Alex had finished printing their sixth and final leaflet. It was a searing indictment of the regime, timed perfectly to follow a major military defeat that had shaken the public's faith. The students carried stacks of these leaflets into the main building of the University of Munich. This was their own campus, but it was also a government building, full of spies, professors aligned with the regime, and the omnipresent threat of the Gestapo. Their plan was to drop the leaflets in the empty hallways before classes began, allowing the students to find them scattered on the ground. Hans and Sophie moved quickly, placing small piles of paper outside lecture halls. They were almost finished. They were on the second floor, ready to leave, when Hans had one final, defining impulse. He picked up the remaining stack of leaflets, hundreds of them, and climbed onto the balustrade overlooking the main atrium. In a single, impulsive, and defining act of defiance, he hurled the entire stack of paper over the railing. The white pages fluttered down, raining over the marble floor below, a silent, swirling protest. For a heart-stopping moment, the entire building stood witness to this shower of truth. It was in that same moment that a janitor, a man named Jakob Schmid, who was an enthusiastic party member, saw them. Schmid screamed and locked the massive doors of the building. Hans and Sophie were trapped. They were arrested immediately. The Gestapo found the final damning evidence, the suitcase full of unused paper and the incriminating drafts of the leaflets. The trial was a sham, a swift and terrible formality. Christoph Probst was arrested later, simply because a draft of a leaflet was found on him. On February 22, 1943, just 4 days after their arrest, Hans Scholl, Sophie Scholl, and Christoph Probst were sentenced to death. Sophie Scholl's final recorded words were a defiant, soaring climax of conviction. Somebody, after all, had to make a start. What we wrote and said is also believed by many others. They just don't dare to express themselves. In that single final statement, she defined not her own fate, but the moral legacy of their entire nation. Hans, Sophie, and Christoph were executed by guillotine just hours after their sentence. They were 24, 21, and 23 years old, but the silence they had broken would never fully return. The extraordinary resolution of this story is what happened next. The final sixth leaflet was smuggled out of Germany, passing through neutral Switzerland. It was translated into English and printed in vast numbers by the Allied forces. Thousands of copies were airdropped by the Royal Air Force onto German cities, with the new title, The Manifesto of the Students of Munich. The very words the regime had tried to silence forever were now raining down from the sky, a thunderous echo of their small, brave act. Their sacrifice was not in vain. The White Rose proved that even in a society where all institutional power is corrupted, the government, the courts, the military, the police, the power of an individual conscience remains unconquerable. They proved that true courage is not the absence of fear. It is the choice to speak the truth even when the fear is greatest. The story of the White Rose is not just a chapter in the history books. It's a challenge to us today. It asks, when have you remained silent when you knew you should have spoken? When have you chosen comfort over conscience? Theirs was a battle fought not with weapons but with principles. They understood that the most profound act of human integrity is refusing to let the voices of hate and deception believe they have won the monopoly on truth. Their story reminds us that every generation has a responsibility to be its own white rose, to protect the quiet right to think, to question, and to speak. They inspire us because they were not saints. They were students. They were friends. They were ordinary people who, when history demanded it, made an extraordinary moral choice. They teach us that the most powerful thing in the world is not the sword of the tyrant. It is a piece of paper, a pen, and the voice of a clear and courageous heart. Every single one of us holds that power today. What will you choose to do with it? Think about the young woman, Sophie Scholl, at 21 years old, facing down the full force of a brutal dictatorship with nothing but her integrity. her sacrifice. Their sacrifice has become a permanent marker for us all, a reminder that the path of moral courage is difficult, perhaps terrifying, but it is the only path that ultimately leads to true human freedom. We remember Hans, Sophie, and Christoph, not for their deaths, but for the profound, beautiful, and absolutely necessary truth they delivered to the world. If the story of the White Rose students and their incredible act of defiance moved you, I encourage you to read more about the other members of the group, like Alexander Schmorell and Willy Graf.